Hello.
morning.
Uh, good evening. Thank you very
Yeah.
much for making the time for me. Really appreciate it.
Sure, yeah. Thanks for having me on your channel as well. Yeah. Good to see somebody interested in the whole perennialism sort of a space. So, yeah,
Yes, it's there are not many of us.
yeah, yeah.
So I've started recording. I think do you need to allow that, or I'm not sure how it looks on your end.
I think it started already. Yeah, I can
Okay,
see it.
wonderful. So all right. So let's get into it.
Sure.
So I'll just give it like a little context about why I want to have this conversation. Um,
Mm-hmm,
Swami Karpatri-ji is very interesting to me because I'm particularly interested in his politics because he
mm-hmm,
offers kind of, as I understand it, an alternative to both the kind of Congress secular liberalism and the Hindu nationalism you have with the BJP. Um,
mm-hmm.
but there's very little available about him in English, which
Right.
is
True.
where you come in. Um, so maybe just to open, you could tell us a little, like, me and the future audience, about who Swami Karpatri-ji was.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So, like you said, I think very little is known about Swami Karpatri-ji in the English spaces in particular. And for that matter, I think even in the Indian languages, it is not that like he's immensely popular. He was perhaps at one point in time, but in the recent years, at least in the last 2, 3 decades, I think he's not that well known. Although in the last, let's say in the last decade or so, I'd say on the internet, things have picked up. There are a lot of people trying to understand, like you said, that. What are the other thought currents that are there in the Indian socio-political spaces or even the spiritual spaces in general. So we have the secular narrative, largely the Nehru Gandhi, that sort of narrative, and then we have the whole upsurge with the RSS BJP narrative. So I think there people started exploring much more of 20th century thought in India on this matter in general, and I think that's where I'd say in the last decade or so, Karpatri-ji has become some sort of a internet sort of a phenomenon on Twitter and places like that. That's how even I got to know of him. I mean, through some friends and some of these discussions, right? So to understand who he was, I think he was many things. I mean, if you look at a typical sort of a life journey of any individual, right? You'll perhaps find people who excel in one particular areas and maybe not get into another sort of areas. But I think Karpatriji was somebody who sort of try to explain the role of dharma in pretty much every other sphere in life. So if you spoke about politics, for example, right? So typically politics is treated more as like a secular sort of a topic in the post 20th century or post enlightenment sort of a discourse. But somebody like Karpatriji kind of contested that. So he said dharma also has an expanse and that also has a role to play in politics, right? So this is somebody who was spiritually, let's say, a very realized soul at the highest sort of a level. But then he didn't stop there. He did indulge with politics. He had a he was one of the founding members of this party called Ramrajya Parishad, which in the early years of Indian independence, 1950 or so, they did contest elections, and he tried to articulate a vision of politics that had, let's say, dharma at the center, or like a more traditional sort of a view. And then he was also somebody who wrote extensively. So he wrote a lot. Some of his books that are popular, or there is this book called Marxwad or Ramraja, which is essentially understanding not just Marx but also the entire Western philosophy and Western thinkers and contrasting them with Indian traditional sort of a thinking. And then he also wrote this other large corpus called Ramayana Mimamsa, which is again a book which is trying to understand what is the Indologist view on Ramayana. How did the Western sort of an audience in the, let's say, 18th, 19th century, right? I mean, the whole German Indology sort of a thinking, and even some of the missionary sort of thinking, how did they all understand Ramayana? What are the flaws in that, and so on. Then he also had works on Veda, which is the so he had this 2, 3 books around that topic, right? Which is again trying to understand how are Vedas understood in tradition, how are Vedas understood by, let's say, some of the 19th, 20th century reformist movements like Arya Samaj, Dayanand Saraswati, so on, and also how Vedas were understood by Indologists and a lot of these historicists sort of thinking that emerged, right? So that's one set of his work. Then, of course, on the more on the devotional or religious sort of side. He did write a lot of books or commentary around Bhagavata, around there is a book called Radha Sudha and things like that. So these are all again like very anchored on let's say bhakti as an emotion, on the
Mm.
relation between the devotee and then the Hindu gods. So that's again one stream of work that he had. Then there is another stream of work he had, which is more on. So this is there's a book called Kala-mimamsa, which essentially means Kala is time. So what is the Indian sense of time, or what is the dharmic or traditional sense of time, and how is that going to be like contrasted with, let's say, the linear time, or the post-enlightenment sort of model, or even that sort of, I mean, in general, like a linear time versus cyclic time sort of conversations, and also how that impacts dating, how that impacts our way of life from a Hindu standpoint, all of that. So this is again one corpus of books. Now, specifically on this particular topic that you just brought up, which is on the like your channel is called political perennialism, right? So, if you're talking about the political theory as a whole, I think Karpatri-ji did indulge a lot in terms of that kind of books as well. So he did write a lot of literature specifically on this particular aspect that you opened this conversation with, right? Which is so he had written books critiquing some of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh's perspective on Hindu Dharma, and he had also written some more books like that just to explain what is the traditional theory of state, what is the dharmic sense of politics, and so on. So I think this is broadly his sphere of work. But outside of that, I mean, outside of, let's say, the literary corpus, he was also somebody who was hugely influential in the traditional segments of the population. So he's somebody who played a key role in resuscitating the Shankaracharya Parampara in at least three mutts in north of India. So in Puri, in Jyotirmath and Dwaraka, these are all various mutts that Shankaracharya had established like centuries ago. And continuing that parampara, so Karpatri-ji had a role to play there as well. So this is somebody who was, in some sense, if you use a very common man sort of an analogy, right? It's some kind of an all-rounder. It is somebody who tried to excel in multiple domains,
Mm.
and all of that kind of showed over the years. So even now today, like let's say we are in 2025, right? It's been quite a while since all of these discussions happened, but he still continues to stay relevant because he's somebody. I think for me personally, I see him as an anchor to this whole perennial sort of a thought stream. Like it's not something that is let's say subject to day-to-day progressivism or to some of these nationalist movements and so on. I think he was really referring to what we call as Sanatana in the Hindu parlance, which is the whole perennial or eternal sort of construct, right? So I think that's the sort of person that he was. And of course, I mean, personally, I am not somebody who is too deep into, let's say, some sort of a diksha or sadhana sort of a person. But there are also people who are into those pursuit who revere Karpatri-ji a lot, because he was also somebody who was like a excelled as a sadhaka, like which is somebody who had realized a lot of these core or the heart of the traditional teachings, and he was somebody who was practicing a lot of it, and he had his own anushtana or his own ritual routine, and he was somebody who, I think, a lot of the ritual or sant samaj, as we call it, those people looked up to for him. So pretty much if you look at the 20th century, every other person of any Hindu religious leader of sorts had a sort of a reverence for Karpatri-ji. So I think that's the sort of personality that he was. Maybe I'm just capturing a part of it because I myself, I'm in the process of discovering and like reminiscing some of his own content, right? So that's broadly where I put it.
Okay, thank you for that. Um, is sorry, you have to remind me the name of his party was the
It was Ram Rajya Parishad.
Ramaraj Parshad. Um, so what was their vision for India? I mean, was it kind of very restorationist, or would it envisage functioning within the existing constitutional order of India? Or I mean, could you go into that a little?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So I think let me also put a qualifier there, right? In some sense, at that time, maybe perhaps it might have appeared that in the 50s or 40s, right, when this whole thing was going on, Karpatri-ji did have like a head-on critique with lot of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh and BJP. BJP didn't even exist at that time, but the parties then can be seen as progenitors of BJP, right? So
Mhm.
he did have a lot of critique, and there was a lot of back and forth that was going on. But like fast forward, let's say 75 years, if you ask somebody like me today, so I am living in this era where, like let's say, like in the last 10 years, BJP government has been ruling the country, right? So if you ask me whether how different or how drastically different is Karpatri-ji's discourse to this, I don't know if it is if it can be seen in a like a 0 to 1 sort of a scale, because the
Mm-hmm.
Hindu society continues to be largely conservative. So the Hindu society is still clinging on to a lot of these traditional paramparas and the traditional sort of a mold. It's not exactly like a modernist sort of a society today. I mean, people talk about Hindu modernity, but I think we are still largely a traditional conservative sort of a place. And wherever I think you have these traditional conservative continuities, Karpatri-ji's discourse does have a role to play. So back to your question, which is how did this party really differentiate it from what like the others who were there in the foray, right? So pretty much, I think in that era, the Karpatri-ji's contestation was really against this sort of a Congress formulation, which is like a secular nationalist sort of a formulation, right? And we just had the partition and we came out of it. So Karpatri-ji was essentially trying to bat for this thing called, we have a whole corpus of teachings called Shastras, which is essentially, so we have Vedas, Shastras, Smritis. These are like various terms that we use for different kinds of corpus or work that we have within the broader Hindu space, in the Hindu sphere. So Karpatriji was trying to understand or trying to explain to us that what is the role of Shastras in this whole modern nation state sort of construct. So prior to the nation state, or let's say even prior to the British colonialism, broadly speaking, the way this geography really operated was you had like bunch of these princely states, each had its own anchor to various sampradayas and paramparas, and things used to run that way. So it was not exactly like a secular sort of setup, right? So even if the king was, let's say, a Muslim, he would have done something with the like the with whole his own royal power to maybe enforce some of his religion to some parts of the population. But then India was never Islamized in that sense, where some other geographies were, right? So uh, I think there was some sort of a truce or some sort of a model where even though the king was, let's say, if the king's faith was something else, but the people still had a way to follow the Hinduism as for their day-to-day practice. So that's how we were for a long time. I think what is unique with this post-independence, post-British handover, right? That is when I think this whole thing called nation state, secularism, all of these things started hitting us as a construct. And even this question of constitution, for example, right? You never had a constitution for the entire country in this sense. So these are all, I think, more of a modern predicament. And what Karpatriji was essentially trying to do was trying to say that you cannot diverse tradition or Sanatana Dharma from all of this. And you cannot say that Sanatana Dharma is something that should be restricted to, let's say, your private spheres. Like this is religion and this is secularism, right? That sort of a space. That is something that he was contesting. So when he was elaborating on some of these constructs around Ramraja Parishad, it was largely around what is the dharmic political theory, what is the dharmic view on a theory of a state, those sort of things. So I think that is where a lot of that discourse was anchored, and it did like contrast a bit with what let's say the Constitution and the founding fathers or Congress as a party was trying to bat for. Right, they were essentially in this mold of let's say a carry forward from the European sort of a mold, right, where they were trying to construct a secular liberal sort of a state, and even the whole liberty, equality, fraternity, French Revolution, all of that. If you look at India's history, we never had a like a formal French Revolution or an American Revolution, all of this, right? So what happened in India with independence is to be seen as a combination of all these forces. So you had the whole whatever happened in Europe with Enlightenment, Reformation, all of that. Even that sort of hit us along with the colonialism. So it is like with colonialism, we got the Britishers, and we just came out of the Islamic conflict. Then the Britishers came in, and then along with colonialism, you got this idea of a nation state. You got this idea of modernization, industrialization, and then secularization, liberalization, and liberalism, all of these things, right? So I think many things hit at one time. And people like Karpatri-ji, I think, were trying to articulate all of this better, trying to explain what all these ideologies are, and then trying to still explain that your traditional theory of state is something else. You cannot have a state which says, I have nothing to do with Hindu Dharma, or I'll treat all religions the same, or I am irreligious, all of this, right? So I think those were the places where he had a lot of contestation in general. So even let's say if you take a specific example, right? So there was in the 1947 to 52, that period. That is when I think some of the biggest legal reforms had taken place in the Indian space. So we had this whole thing called Hindu Code Bills, which were put in there, which is essentially trying to put a legal sort of a framework around Hindu personal laws. So again, there people like Karpatri-ji and at that time even like RSS, they were all batting against it at that point in time because they were saying that this is like against the principle of secularism because you said you'll be secular, so you won't interfere in matters of religion, but how come you are now taking it over? So these are the places where again Karpatri-ji contested that let's say the way the Congress did it then, they did all this only for Hinduism. So they said Muslims are not ready for it, so let us not touch their personal law. So even 75 years after independence, that's pretty much the state. And even though let's say the Hindu laws were touched, Karpatri-ji's contestation was that you are trying to do it without any sense of adhikara or pramana in shastras, which means essentially you are trying to do something which is based on a secular rubric and you're not relying on what the shastra says. So the Hindu construct, let's say, bad for decentralization and diversity. So Karpatri-ji talks about that a lot, that we are not this like one religion, one law sort of a people. We are a dharmic sort of a civilization, and you had a lot of these strands. So you have, so we have this thing called jati, which in the secular parlance we use the word caste. So you have jati, varna, all of this, and then you have these regions, then you have these languages. So with all these together, right, it's like a conglomeration of a multiple sort of a laws. There's no one Hindu way of life in the sense of a uniformity
Mm-hmm.
sort of a perspective, right? That doesn't exist. So I think that is something Karpatri-ji was contesting a lot. That if you really want to like bat for that sort of a diversity, then you have to rely on the authority of shastras because the shastra is the one which helps you balance these diversities while still staying united, let's say at the layer of a principle. So even though you have these apparent diversities, you are still united at some level. And this also helps, let's say, so when we typically say Hinduism, I think we have some sort of specific stereotypes or archetypes in our mind. But in how it played out in reality, let's say you go to a forest, people who are today called tribals, in the Karpatri-ji universe, they would also be seen as Hindus because they would be seen as one particular jati of Hindus. Because the tribals of today, whom we call them, they would still be doing like ancestral worship. They might still be doing, let's say, a worship of multiple murtis or idols, some sort of a polytheistic sort of a thing, right? So I think that sort of a model is what this sort of dharmic pluralism, if you call it, that enabled, which is to say that you define some set of first principles and then you build these bridges across these multiple variations and everybody will have their own sort of a spin-off or their own sort of a ritual model and their own sort of rules and customizations on top of it. But it was trying to build this sort of a harmony amongst all these diversities without calling for some sort of a uniformity.
Mm.
So what was happening with this whole nation state and secularization sort of a construct in Karpatri-ji's contestation was that you are essentially trying to uniformize all of these Hindu pluralism, and you are also trying to secularize it by like taking it away from the authority of the Shastras. So if you ask somebody, let's say, why are you conducting your life in so and so way, they would perhaps say, this is my ancestral tradition and this is what my Shastra says. This is what, so we use this word called parampara, which means essentially your ancestral continuity.
Mm.
So that's what we do, right? So, but in a secular liberal sort of a construct, it doesn't work that way. So if you make a rule, then the rule has to be the same for everybody in the group because the whole model of community in a secular liberal sort of a model is that everybody who belong to a community should all be the same in some aspect. So in the legal parlance, they should all have the same law. But in the dharmic construct, it was more like this legal pluralism sort of a model where we never enforced like one particular law for everybody. And what Karpatri-ji was like fighting against is essentially this, that first you are trying to uniformize what is not uniform. And then you are also trying to do it based on your own authority, which is not a Shastric authority. So let's say in the Shastras, to give an example, right? So and this is something that keeps playing out even today. So in the Hindu universe, we have this thing called a Gotra. So what a Gotra is essentially that everybody will tie themselves up to 6 or 7 generation of Rishis or 4 generations of Rishis, and they say that I belong to this particular lineage of these rishis. So I may have a name for my Gotra and you may have your name for Gotra. And there is a rule which says that people who belong to the same Gotra should not get married. And
Mm.
why is this so? It's essentially a spiritual or transcendental sort of a construct, and it's impossible to explain it from a rational sort of a standpoint. And of course, I mean, people can still try to put some sort of a scientific spin on it and still give some justification. But the fundamental rule of the practice is essentially because of a shastric mandate, which is like a transcendental, spiritual, or a dharmic sort of a construct. But in a civic law sort of space, what happened in that era was that people said, but these are all like old rules, these are outdated rules, and they are not something that a new secular nation state has to follow, and we need to reform Hinduism. So I think this whole current that kept on playing out for, let's say, easily about 7 decades from 1850 onwards, 7 to 8 decades, and then now again post-independent India, another 7, 8 decades. This whole current of reformism that was going on, I think that is what Karpatri-ji was trying to contest heavily, that you should not succumb to this idea that we have to keep reforming the religion to please every single progressive fad, right? Because, I mean, what was important, let's say, 70 years ago is now not. Now there's like a new set of things keep coming up, right? Like in the Hindu legal space, we had this thing come up recently where we had to legalize the same-sex marriage, for example. And in other countries in West, a lot of debates have happened on that. Some countries have legalized, some are not, right? So in India, we still haven't. So these are all again questions that keep coming to the same picture, that what is the basis on which you can decide something is right, something is wrong, something is appropriate, something is inappropriate. And that is where people like Karpatri-ji, they argued that in the Hindu context, if you have to decide what is right, what is wrong, what is dharma, what is adharma, you have to rely on the authority of Shastras. And that is the point where he had some sort of a criticism or contestation with what like what is RSS then and what is BJP today. So the whole RSS BJP universe in general, his criticism of them was that you are not telling me what your Hinduism is. So when you say Hindu nationalism, what does the word Hindu mean in your Hindu nationalism? Explain to me what that means. Are you going to rely on this particular darshana? Are you going to rely on this particular shastra? Or are you going to say, I'm going to be like this particular time in the ancient past? I'm going to follow these rules, that sort of a thing, right? So this sort of a back and forth kept happening in his era, where he was questioning all these new movements that were happening and asking them to explain what does Hinduism mean? What does the word Hindu mean? And tell me the pramana for that, which means tell me the authority based on which you are saying this is your definition of Hindu, right? So that kept happening. And I think even today, that contestation still remains. So people, if you follow some of the BJP, RSS sort of a political discourse, they try to bat for both sides. So sometimes they bat for a lot. I mean, they're like very pro-tradition, pro-conservative sort of a mold. Sometimes they get into a very like a Western nation state sort of a mold. So this keeps happening all the time. So if you ask me, I'd actually see that like all of these currents are still playing out within the BJP RSS universe. I think even they haven't really like fully figured out or formulated like what this means. So I think some of these are like really unanswered questions. Although I mean we do see a lot of like strong progressive reformist sort of a strand, but there is also this conservative traditional sort of strand. And as I said, most of the people are still conservative. So most of the people or Hindus who vote for BJP, they continue to be very conservative. So if you ask them what their definition of Hinduism is, they'll all say that we are just following whatever our ancestors have followed. This is what our shastras say. This is what my custom says. In the Hindu parlance, we use this word called achara. So achara is essentially custom or practice. So
Mm.
that's how people define it. That so I think a lot of the people still continue to have this ancestral connect, but in the sense of this grand political theory, we are still not clear on what does like a Hindu nation state really mean. So if you say a Hindu Rashtra, what does it really mean, and how is it different from the other sort of, let's say, theological states that have been formulated, right? So some of the popular accusations that we get on the Hindu side broadly on this is that if you reject the secular nation state sort of a formulation, like if you reject like how let's say America is, that sort of a thing, then you are essentially taking India to become like a Hindu Taliban or a
Mm.
Hindu Pakistan. So
Mm.
this is the sort of accusation that people sort of put through. And I think somebody like Karpatri-ji was, I mean, he did quite a bit of articulation to explain how this is going to be different. because Karpatri-ji was somebody who was batting for all these diversities. So when he writes about a Ramaraja, or when he writes about a particular frame of Hindu Rashtra, he is not referring to a state where all Hindus are alike, in the sense that, and then he's also, in fact, in one of his books, which is called Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh or Hindu Dharma, which is a front-on critique of lot of then ideology of RSS. He actually questions them that if you don't address all these questions of diversities, you might end up creating a state which is closer to what Hitler and Mussolini sort of they created in those eras in Europe, right? Like early 20th centuries. We don't want to get into this sort of a formulation of Hinduism where the only definition of Hinduism is being anti-Muslim. He
Mm.
explicitly says this. So
Mm.
in one of his critiques on the RSS dialogues, which happened, so he says that if you don't address this question of the Shastra basis for Hinduism and how you manage all these diversities within Hindu Dharma, then if you take out everything, right, then the only thing that will be left is to say that my Hinduism is being anti-Muslim. And
Mm.
that is something he contested, because that will take you very close to this territory of that particular flavor of European nationalism, which was very close to the Nazi sort of a model. And
Mm.
that is something Karpatri-ji heavily contested, that the Hindu Rashtra should not become like a Nazi state where your entire self-definition of the state should not become that my definition is based on persecuting, in that context, it was Jews, but it should not become that my definition of a state is based on persecuting a particular minority. So that is something that he was contesting. But then at the same time, to your earlier point, he was also rejecting the Congress formulation, which is the secular syncretic sort of a formulation. And that's where I think some of the Gandhi discussion also comes into the picture. I know, like when you reached out to me at the start, I remember you said
Mm.
you wanted to understand Karpatri-ji, Hindutva, and then Gandhi also. So I think Gandhi, Congress, Nehru, I think this is some sort of a continuum. So I think Gandhi's model also was somewhere like this, where he didn't want to emphasize on Shastras at all. And he was also trying to construct some sort of a perennial philosophy sort of a mold, right? He was trying to appeal to something which will appeal equally to Hindus and Muslims, like level up, two levels up, and then try to say that all religions are from the same fount, sort of a thing. But then I think the way it played out in the Gandhian construct was that he tried to anchor the whole thing too much on the Hindu-Muslim unity or Hindu-Muslim syncretism sort of an aspect. And neither were Hindus nor Muslims ready for that sort of a model, even though, let's say, the Hindu side was ready to make some more compromises. But I think the Muslim side was very clear in terms of what they wanted in that era, right? So you had Jinnah, you had Muhammad Islam, you had Syed Ahmad Khan, and there's a recent book that came out in the last few years that Pakistan is essentially this idea of creating a new Medina. So they were quite clear in terms of what they wanted to extract. So then when the partition failed, uh, and when this whole idea of united India failed and partition happened, right? And then Gandhi's assassination, all that. So at that stage, I think we had like two options which were possible, or rather three perhaps. One is this Hindu nationalistic sort of a model that RSS, Golwalkar and Hegde they were all promoting, Savarkar, for example. And then the other option we had is the Nehruvian secular liberal sort of state, like Pakistan may be a theocracy, but we are not. We are going to be a secular, liberal, multicultural sort of a state. That was essentially the Nehruvian modernist sort of a pitch. And then we had Karpatri-ji's choice, which is the whole Ram Rajya Parishad sort of a model. Uh, I think we took the Nehruvian route, which is essentially a continuum of the Gandhian model, although there were some significant differences, particularly in the model of economy and things like that. But and then, of course, Nehru was much more secular. Gandhi was perhaps spiritual. He didn't give up this idea of like spirituality and politics. He continued to believe that politics and religion should not be divorced, except that his definition of religion was much more expansive, and he was trying to build this sort of a supra religion, like I mentioned, something that blends into like Hinduism, Islam, Christianity. He was trying to build some sort of a universalized spiritual sort of a model. And I think he was trying to anchor his politics based on that. But then Nehru, I think, went further up from there. And I think he saw the Nehruvian model or Nehru Ambedkarite sort of a model. It was mostly anchored on the modern sort of a nation state construct, where they said that like church state separation, religion should be kept out of the state. And it was more of a secular construct. So we went that road. And after maybe 3-4 decades of that, right? So from 1947 to, let's say, 1992, when the whole 1990, 92, when Ram Mandir, Babri, all of that happened. And then the era of post-liberalization, and 2010 onwards is when like BJP really spiked up over time. So I think if you look at that, you probably can look at this as a transition where people at some level, the popular mandate at least, said that we are done with this model of secularism where you are essentially saying state will be neutral, but it ended up in a model where you are doing minority appeasement and you are doing also a very reformist sort of a bent on Hinduism specifically, right? Like I said, Nehru started with reforming Hindu laws. He never went into reforming Muslim laws or Christian laws, and then he let them be. And all of the focus was on Hindu reformism. And temples, the way Hindu temples are managed also, right? So the Hindu temples are the biggest of temples are still under government control. Although it's a secular state, the secular state said that, but we need to manage Hindu temples. So I
Mm.
think there were a lot of these contradictions that have happened over time. And even in terms of education, I think the it was way too secularized, and also there was a lot of this Hindu reformist twang in it. And I think people didn't quite like all of that. So we shifted from that to let's say the whatever BJP and RSS was able to mobilize and was able to push for as a model of Hindu nationalism or Hindu revivalism and all of that. But Karpatri-ji's route, I think, is more of like neither this nor that, although it has got some commonalities with some of what goes by under the RSS BJP moniker today. There is some commonality. It is not like it is like a totally disjoint set, but I think it is more of so even in this discourse that Karpatri-ji has with on Goldwalker's book. So his question is this: that let's say you appreciate the like worshipping this Rama and Krishna as the Hindu gods, then he asked them that then do you just stop with worshipping, or do you also try to understand how they conducted their own lives and what was their message to Hinduism? Then are you going to approve of living as per Shastras? So I think everything again comes back to that, where Karpatri-ji wants to essentially understand what exactly does this, when you say Hindu nationalism, what does Hindu mean? So he keeps pushing more and more on that. So there is a lot of arguments from Karpatri-ji's side where he questions this thing that you need to get down to the specifics, because in the broader dharmic universe, right, we have a lot of these things called darshanas, which is essentially various schools of philosophy. So you have a school of philosophy called Charvaka, which is essentially at some level it is something that is anchored just on the sensory sort of a plane. So I believe only what I can like feel, touch, and see sort of model. So it rejects this idea of karma. It rejects the idea of recurring like reincarnation or punarjanma. It rejects a lot of these other sort of ritual universe and all of that. So Karpatri-ji's question is really that if you say Hinduism, then that's not enough. You need to get explicit saying my Hinduism is not the Hinduism of the Charvakas. Then again, then the next darshana is of Buddhism. Then the next darshana is of Jainism. So he gets into all that. So you need to then explain to me that is your model of society going to be like a Buddhist society? And then he critiques that. He says that a Buddhist sort of a model. So Buddhism also has a lot of flavors, right? So there's like a Shunyavada and all of that. So he gets into that. So are you trying to build a society based on Shunyavada? And then he gets into Jainism. Then he says that, are you trying to build a society based on Jainavada? Because Jainism also has a lot of these multiple philosophical strands within that, right? So there is one particular strand which is called it's called Syadvada or Anektavada, which is essentially something that doesn't take any position. It says you may be right, I may be right, he may be right, that perspective may be right, maybe it is not, maybe it is. It's that sort of thing. It doesn't take any stance. So he questions that. Then are you trying to run a society based on that sort of a indecisive sort of a positioning? Or are you going to say that I'm going to rely on Shastras, and then I'm going to imagine a Hindu society that runs based on Shastras? So there's a lot of this that keeps happening all the time. I think it's quite complex, all of these interactions. And it's also very difficult to like understand for somebody who maybe like has not studied, let's say, these 100, 200 years of history, right? Because so much happened in that time period. That's how I see it. And a lot of these are still unanswered questions. So it is not like, so let's say if today, we can decide saying that let's just switch to Karpatri-ji's model, right? It's not going to happen because I mean, that's just at a very abstract sort of a principle layer. And there's still a lot of questions that need to be answered. And there are a lot of conflicts that need to be resolved. It is not something that is straightforward. So I think that's the kind of situation where India is today, where I mean, there's a lot of people who, both on the RSS BJP side and even on the traditional side in general, people crave for a lot of like sense of identity, that we should not just copy paste what like a European model of a state or an American model of a state. We should be something else. We should be a dharmic state, but then again, we should not be, like I said, we should not be just a Hindu Pakistan or a Hindu Taliban. We are not that. We are something else. So there's a lot of this thinking, and there's a lot of this continuous rumination that goes on. So this is, I think, I'd still say it is work in progress, but Karpatri-ji is definitely a very good anchor for anybody trying to understand some of these questions. Because Karpatri-ji was essentially trying to argue that some of these is essentially perennial or sanatana, that these are not things that you can say, this is something maybe it worked in the 16th century, let's not do it now, or this is something that worked pre-modernity, let's not do it now. So he was somebody who was contesting that if you start giving up on one aspect, saying this is not modern, or like this is not good for the modern world, then if you keep making all of these compromises, then at some level you'll become like indistinguishable from those who you think who are your enemies, right? So he keeps asking this question in that a book where he criticized some of the propositions of Goldwalker in that era. That, tell me how are you different from Christians? Tell me how are you different from Muslims? Tell me how are you different from communists? Tell me how are you different from socialists? And all of this, right? So he keeps asking these questions. Essentially, I think he was trying to avoid this sort of a scenario where we Abrahamize Sanatan Dharma, if I were to put it that way, which is to say that he wanted to avoid a model where Hindus let go of Shastras as an anchor altogether, and then get into this model where like you have one nation, one God, one language, that sort of a model. I think that is something he was trying to contest a lot. And that's something that is seen even to this day. Like I said, a lot of these are unresolved questions. Now and then these things keep popping up all the time, where somebody will say, we are all one community, so we should all be alike. And then the Hinduism doesn't operate that way. We have so many diversities. Even if I step out, so I stay in a community, let's say of 200 other houses, but I step out, every other house will have its own spin on Hinduism. I cannot just say that we are all the same. So I think there's a lot of diversity, but at the same time, it's also not chaotic. So I think the difference between Karpatri-ji and some of the modern commentators is also that where people cannot process this Hindu diversity. But Karpatri-ji was somebody who was trying to say that this is not like an anything goes or a chaotic diversity where one strand doesn't have anything to do the other strand. There is indeed a Shastra basis for all of this, and there is indeed a way in which the Shastra architecture manages all of this diversity. So, like I said at the start, right? So, we have this notion called an achara. Achara is like a custom and a tradition sort of a thing. So, we also, the Shastra, which is the ritual corpus or the traditional corpus, that allows for this construct called lokachara, which means loka is what you see around you, and achara is customs, which is essentially all the customs that you see on the land, right? So it is that's the distinction between a typical, let's say, what you see in some of these Islamic states, where there's a lot of contestation that happens, let's say around hijab or things like that, right? I mean, you read from time to time that like music was banned or education for women was banned or things like that. So they operate in a universe where a single rule is applied on the entire population. But the Hindu model, the Shastric model, it accommodated for this through this construct called Lokachara. Lokachara essentially gave you the flexibility to say that if you have, let's say, 15 different regions in your broader group, each region can have its own sort of a ritual universe, its own sort of multiplicity in traditions and customs. So in the traditional parlance, we use this word called Shastra Aviruddha Lokachara, which means the Lokachara, which is not against Shastras. So although you accounted for this diversity, there's a lot of this back and forth that happens to understand. If you say, I am open for diversity, do you mean that you are open for anything and everything? That's where there's a lot of this dialogue that happens, that this particular achara is okay because it is not violating Shastras. This particular achara is not okay because it does violate Shastras. So I think that is where you can again see some contemporary parallels, right? So with all this wokism, all of that happened, right? And some of that manifestation is essentially this, where they said you have to tolerate anything and everything. And then people started doing certain sort of things which, I mean, they were repelling for some, and there's again this whole rebellion against wokism and all of this, right? So I think the Hindu model of diversity, what I call maybe you call it like a dharmic diversity, because that was a diversity that was again moderated on dharma. It was not an anything goes diversity, and you did not have to tolerate anything and everything. So Karpatri-ji was essentially trying to bat for this sort of a model where you have pluralism, but that pluralism is anchored in Shastras and it is not anything goes. And at the same time, each strand could retain its own uniqueness. So let's say you're born into one particular jati, nobody will force you to move to another jati and follow that jati's customs. You can still retain your own stand. And that's something that he continued to bat for. And that is something that led to a lot of contestation with the entire reformism that happened in the colonial era, like about 100 years of reformism, right? So the most of the reformism is really around this whole construct of whether a person's caste is based on his birth or it is based on his karma. So the varna is based on the janma or varna is based on karma. And these fights keep happening all the time, even today. And Karpatri-ji is somebody who insisted that per Shastras, varna is a lineage-based thing and it has to be based on janma. So if you are born into a Brahmin sort of a lineage, you need to be a Brahmin. You cannot become a Brahmin by doing something else from outside. So I think that was a sort of view that he had, which is the Shastric sort of a view where for a long time for centuries, Hinduism was anchored on these hereditary sort of lineages and continuities. And with the modern epoch, I think there was a lot of this questioning that came up where people said that why is it that you are anchoring so much on hereditary continuities? Why is it that Varna should be based on Janma? Why can't it be based on Karma? Why is it that you have these Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra, Antyaja, all of these constructs? And why is it that we can't have why can't we have just one Hindu sort of a construct? Why should we get into all this? So that is something that is like a central conflict point, both with reformers, let's say of the secular kind, and also the reformers of the Hindutva kind, and then who continued into the RSS BJP sort of a discourse where people continue to contest this thing that why do you have this birth-based rules and regulations and birth-based sort of a model, right? So, in fact, some of the largest contestations in the 20th century history of India, if you'd see, there's a lot of debates that happened, let's say, on aspects like temple entry. So, in the early part of 20th century, there was a lot of these debates that happened around can all castes have the eligibility to get into the temples, because we did have rules at that time which said that if you are from so and so caste, then you can't enter into the sanctorum of the temple. You need to take the darshan from, let's say, the exterior precincts of the temple. So there were rules like this because I think at least in that era we didn't have this thing called a public Hindu temple. So that is something, again, that's a manifestation of the modern sort of a predicament where in the 20th century, because this whole Varna Jati sort of a model weakened and there were much more conflicts between each of these Varnas, I think this whole thing came up that we should not have any of these differences or rules based on Varnas, and you should have a model where all Hindus are treated alike. So this is again one of the biggest conflict points where somebody like Karpatri-ji differed with the broader reformist discourse of that era. And he continued to argue that Hinduism is anchored on all of these hereditary continuities. Each has its own sort of rules and regulations and its own universe. So he contested this thing that you cannot try to construct this one sort of one Hindu sort of an identity that is common for everyone. So I think that's something that's a contestation that it continues to play out even today. Nobody knows like a good answer to that. Our constitution, for example, we've had a whole social justice discourse for about 75 years now, where we try to do a lot of affirmative action and all of that. But castes as an identity have not gone away. Maybe they have gone away for 20% of the population of Hindus, perhaps, but 80% still continue to intermarry within their groups. So endogamy still persists. So caste as an identity still persists, and caste, jati, kula, varna, these are all, I think, some similar names. Although, I mean, there's a lot of scholarly debate on what is the right name to use, what carries what baggage, and all of that. But somebody like Karpatri-ji argued for these identities. So he said that you cannot have a Hinduism where you let go of these identities. So you cannot let go of these Brahmin by Janma as an identity and then just say everybody is Hindu by Janma. So he was somebody who was continuing to argue that everybody these Varna by Janma identities need to continue across the board. So he was arguing for these continuities. And so I think today's reality is it's like quite messed up in that sense that people carry those identities, but they really don't have a ritual universe to anchor them around those identities. They really don't have a social system that is anchored around those identities. And this is something some of the perennial philosophy school folks, right, like Ananda Kumara Swami and all, they've written at length about some of these disruptions, right? Like so a lot of this worked well in a pre-industrial sort of setup, post-industrial revolution and post-modernity. A lot of these identities also, I mean, there's a lot of conflict. There are a lot of these hereditary professions. I mean, that whole thing got broken with industrialism, right? So a lot of the identities became meaningless. So this whole thing is anchored around the father's profession continues to the son's profession sort of a model, right? So Kumaraswamy wrote at length about this sort of a model, but that could not survive this onslaught of modernity. So you had the people who could not continue with their ancestral professions, and then you had this whole public schooling sort of model that came up with the colonial epoch. And suddenly everybody started. I mean, the model meant that everybody needs to aspire for every profession, right? So that is pretty much the modern predicament where what you do in life is should not be determined by what your ancestors have done. So everybody wants to take a shot at becoming something else, and that's a whole American dream sort of a construct and a post-French Revolution sort of a construct, right? So I think all of that. The some of this is the reason why this whole debate between RSS and Karpatri-ji sort of manifested, because I think RSS and Hindutva as an ideology is a post 20th century construct, right? So it was born into modernity. It was born into this era where nation state was there. It was born into this era where the threat of Islam was evident. The threat of British colonialism was evident, and the creation of a nation state was very imminent. So many nation states in Europe also came up the prior century, right? I mean, Italy happened, like Mussolini, Mazzini, all of that, right? So there's Hitler, German nationalism, so much was happening, right? But the traditional universe, I think, was not anchored on any of these per se, right? Because it's much more older and Sanatana, perennial sort of a configuration. So I think it didn't have a formulation for like answers for some of these questions. Like if you say that all of these jatis need to continue the way they are, right? Then you need to also have a model where everybody agrees for this hereditary professional succession sort of a model. But that is something that flies against the whole industrial society as a construct, right? Even if you look at French Revolution, for example, um, there is this whole notion of careers open to talents, which is essentially, I mean, the whole thing of breaking aristocracy, breaking monarchy, and breaking these continuities, hereditary continuities across lineages, right? So that was the model. But this whole Varnashrama model is on the opposite side. It anchored so much on these hereditary continuities. And I think as a society, we were like, we didn't know what to do with that rupture. So I think that is where a lot of this discomfort comes in from the RSS Hindutva sort of a camp, where there is this, they question back that we need this some sort of a Hindu Jati sort of an identity, a Hindu identity. We cannot continue to anchor on these hereditary sort of continuities, especially when hereditary professions have broken and people are not in the village economy anymore, right? Like everybody is trying to do everything else, and there's a lot of movement. So you cannot continue to have these rules that you can marry only in this group, you should not marry in that group, or you cannot have these rules on essentially on endogamy based rules. You cannot have so much of diversity saying that like I am a Hindu, but I am also a Hindu from this particular jati, so I'll only be like follow this, follow that. But I think they were trying to address the modern predicament where they wanted to somehow construct this sort of a Hindu sort of a layer, protective layer outside, right? So that is something that stays, and that is something that helps construct and carve out some sort of an identity which is different from a secular sort of an identity. So they also acknowledge this threat from Islam, partition, all of that. So I think a lot of these things were at play, and I think they continue to happen even today. So even today, we still have this problem. We don't know. I mean, like I said, right? These identities have not vanished. 80% or 85% of Hindus still carry a lot of these ancestral identities. There is no one definition or one picture of how a Hindu who should be. It is not like everybody will wear one dress, everybody will speak one language, sort of a thing, right? We still have tens and hundreds of languages in the country. We still have, so even if you take something as simple as like the construction of a Hindu temple, there are perhaps still about 100 different styles of constructing a Hindu temple. A temple in one region looks very different from a temple in another region. Same thing with festivals. So we have just way too much diversity there as well. So we have a lot of these ancestral diversities, and we still are unable to construct this one homogeneous Hindu sort of identity. And this conflict is like never ending. So I think, yeah, like I still don't know how to process some of this discourse of Karpatri-ji given all of this, but I still see some sense of anchor there where I think this whole notion that you still have to have anchor in shastras and your achara or how you conduct your life is what defines your Hinduism, and it cannot be just like a mere political sort of a construct where territorial nationalism or like just because you want to protect your borders and you have an identity that cannot become like your Hindu identity. Neither can your Hindu identity be that I am anti this particular identity. So anti-Islam cannot be the definitional identity of Hinduism. Neither can anti-Christianity be the identity, right? It can't be just in opposition of something else. It has to stand for something. And what that something is where I think a lot of Karpatri-ji's discourse will help. But it's still a work in progress, as I said. So I don't think there is a ready-made formulation where people can jump into to say this is the new model of Hindu Rashtra. And neither is the effort to build a consensus on this going to be easy because, as I said, Karpatri-ji was somebody who emphasized on a lot of these Varna Jati based rules, which in the popular parlance today, there is not as much currency to some of these. So I think a lot of this is still, I mean, there's a lot of friction. It's not going to be easy to build this sort of a consensus. But I think it's still useful. Like I said, if you look at some of these conflicts that are playing out today outside of the Indian context, like I said, I mean, there's this whole wokeism, liberalism, post-liberalism, all of that, right? So there's a lot of scholars who are now talking about is secularism really the right sort of a model? Was it right to do a church school separation? Was it right to do a church state separation? Should the public square really be religion agnostic? If you leave the public square as a vacuum, then wokeism will take over. So you should also have some play for religion in that. So they're all trying to, I mean, a lot of this churn is happening in the West as well, right? So I think in that context, some of Karpatri-ji's own writing and thinking on this topic that you cannot diverse dharma away from politics. You cannot treat politics as a like a secular sort of a sphere. You need to also consider some of these constructs that we have, right? Like so, we have a entire corpus of literature in the dharmic spaces called so we have this thing called Rajadharma, which means how should the king conduct himself. We have this notion of Rajaniti, which is again how should the king conduct himself and his kingdom, right? So we have all of that sort of a literature as well. So dharma is not something where we didn't diverse conducting of the society or polity or politics away from dharma, right? So it was still quite integral. Same thing with, let's say, something like commerce or economy and all of that. You had Arthashastra, which again has a lot of these things on polity, on governance, on economics, and all of that. So somebody like Karpatri-ji was trying to argue for that Shastra sort of a basis for everything. And he continued to emphasize that you should not let go of Shastras. So any model of Hinduism that divorces away from these Shastras and then just clings on to some sort of an empty nationalistic rhetoric. I think that is something that he was heavily contesting. Yeah,
That was very interesting. Thank you very much. Um,
sure.
I have two questions that came up to me as you were speaking, so I'll keep them in mind. So the first one is I'm interested in what the specific scriptural sources for Karpatri-ji's thought were. So, I mean, you
Mhm.
mentioned Shastras. Are there Shastras or are there texts that provide justification for example, monarchy, which seems to be the central constitutional form of
Mhm. Mhm.
polity? So it's a bit of a three-part question. That's part one.
Right,
Part two is the one text that I assume, but I'm not sure, is part of his thought is the Artha Shastra.
right.
Um, and so is that part? Because let me just frame why I'm asking.
Mhm.
Because, that text is usually portrayed, at least in the West, as a kind of ancient Indian Machiavelli. And what
Right.
I think is very interesting is that if you read what Kumar Swami has to say about that text, he doesn't see it that way at all. He sees it as a very
Hmm.
spiritually grounded text. So if you could
Right.
speak to that. And then the third question is, um, one of the things that, because we spoke about Gandhi, one of the things that's sort of interesting about Gandhi is that he does engage with some Western
Right.
thought. So
Hmm.
does Western thought play any kind of role in Swami Karpatri-ji's thoughts? I mean, for
Hmm.
example,
Hmm.
does he ever reference de Maistre? That seems like one thinker that might resonate with him. Or is
Hmm.
it totally endogenous to India? The sources of his thought. So there's a three-part question for you.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So maybe let me try to quickly summarize, right? So the first one you asked was about multiple, like what are the sources for some of these, when I say Shastra, what are these sources, right? So that's one. And then you asked for the whether you have a Shastric justification for something like a monarchy in the this context. And then um, the other piece that you asked about is also in the sense of whether there's a Western sort of a discourse also in Karpatri-ji's thought, right? So
And,
as I
and
said,
sorry, also the Artha Shastra, if that's something that
yeah,
he
yeah,
engaged
yeah,
with.
yeah,
Yeah.
right, yeah, yeah. So I think typically the word Shastra, right, it is used to refer to a vast majority, like vast body of works. So that you have a Shastra for everything. So in the Hindu context, like you also have something called a Natya Shastra. So the Natya Shastra is essentially like you can think of it. I mean, it's a very crude translation, but you can think of it as like a science of art, drama, and that sort of a thing, right? So you have a Shastra for that. So Ardhashastra is there. Then you have this whole corpus of texts on Rajadharma and Rajaniti, and you also have in the Mahabharata, right? You have a lot of the society needs to run, how kings need to conduct themselves, so on. So when you say Shastras, I think it is referring to a lot of these things put together. So Karpatri-ji's work, he has referred to a lot of these in pockets, where when he is citing something, he'll be citing from multiple of these sources. And he is trying to explain that this is how things were, and this is the Shastra's point on this particular aspect. So let's say if you take something like I said, on the matter of legal pluralism, for example, right? Should we have like one uniform Hindu law sort of a thing? He gives examples from all of these sources and then says that this is how we manage diversity. This is what Manusmriti says, or this is what Arthashastra says. It is like that. So it is that sort of a referencing that continues to happen all the time. Now, specifically on the topic of like monarchy, I think in the Indian context, this idea of a Raja is a bit different from that of a monarch. And typically, I think in the, let's say, the Catholic Europe sort of a construct, you also have like um, a hierarchy or some sort of a pyramidal sort of a structure, right? I mean, there's a king, and then there's also the Pope, and then there is God. So I think that model kind of operates a bit differently. And even if you take the way the church is organized, right? I mean, there's a papal hierarchy. I mean, you have the parish papal hierarchy and all of that. Hinduism doesn't have that sort of a model. So even if you take something like a Shankaracharya, for example, you don't have like a national Shankaracharya. You don't have like one Shankaracharya for the country. Even in Adi Shankaracharya's own times, he built these matas in four corners of the country, and there are also a few other matas which claim that sort of authenticity and lineage. But these are all this is more like a network. So you don't have like a single sort of authority. So Karpatri-ji is somebody who was very close to that Dashnami Sampradaya, but it was not like I mean, we don't have an equivalent of a pope sort of a structure, right? So the same applies for a monarch as well. So although you have these constructs of, we have a construct called Chakravarti, which is like an emperor of like multiple kingdoms and all of that, right? We have all that, but the monarch, it was not like a god incarnate or that sort of a picture, right? So if you read some of these works of Kumaraswamy, for example, he kind of elaborated on these differences between the that sort of model and the Dharmic sort of model. So in the Hindu context, even the king is subordinate to Dharma. So Dharma is like supreme, and Dharma is not exactly in the same sense as a god, right? So Dharma is I don't know how else to translate it. It perhaps is very unique, non-translatable sort of a construct. But so I think that there is a bit of a difference there. But like I said, you have a lot of these texts which explain how a king needs to be trained, what is the responsibility of the king, and even in our own kavyas, right? So you have this whole literature of so that there may be a particular work of poetry where some situation was being described, but that in that also they'll get into some of these on how should a king conduct himself and all of that. So when we refer to something called shastras, it is not also like one book. So you'll also have like a long corpus of all of these, which are essentially feeding into how a king should conduct himself and things like that. So, as a traditional training of some of these kings, right? So, we have works which explain how a 16th century king was conducted his day-to-day life. So you'll see that the king wakes up, he does so and so activity, and then he'll also have time to read some of these works. And what are those works? You will again find references to this kind of works, right? And then there's a Smriti corpus is again very big. So Manusmriti is of course like one of the oldest and one of the most analyzed texts perhaps. So we have Manusmriti, we have Yajnavalkya Smriti, we have Parashara Smriti, and we have like a whole bunch of Smritis there. Then we also have something called a Nibandhana Granthas sort of thing, which is like a compendium of some of these things. So in all of these, you'll again find sections which are referring to aspects of governance, aspects of polity, aspects of how the king needs to conduct himself, or how the king needs to resolve conflicts, or let's say you conquer a particular kingdom, then how do you manage this fact that this kingdom has different laws and another kingdom has different laws, right? So all of those aspects again come into the picture. So going back to what I spoke at the start, if you look at the Hindu diversity, you never had a situation where, let's say, somebody take like you don't have this colonizing sort of a model where you take over a territory and then impose your language, your customs, your traditions on that region. So you find some of these in Smritis, where in the Smritis they explicitly say that you as a king, if you conquer this kingdom, let their lokacharas or let their customs continue so long as they are not conflicting with shastras. So there is that always that balance where it's some kind of, let's say, like a pro diversity, pro pluralism sort of an outlook, which is there in our literature. So this you find in Smriti corpus. So when we talk about shastras, it is really like a conglomeration of all of this. It's not like one book. You'll find it in like multiple of these sort of areas. So I think so that's the answer to the first part of the question, right, on monarchy and then sources. Let me address this other part specifically on the Western sources, right? So you're right that somebody like Kumaraswamy, let's say, because I mean, because of his own unique predicament, right? He was also somebody aligned more with this perennialist sort of a philosophy. So he was not somebody who was just talking about something like addressing one sliver of audience, right? He was not addressing just the Hindus. He was essentially somebody playing out in this broader traditional versus modernity sort of a conflict. So I think his discourse is a bit different, where he does anchor on a lot of these broader traditional base, and he also talks about let's say like some of these pre-enlightenment sort of concepts as well, and Western sources as well. Karpatri-ji, like I said at the start, he did write this large volume of book which is called Marxvada or Ramrajya. Although it says Marx and Ramaraja, it also analyzes a lot of Western political thought in general. So in that book, you would find pretty much every other Western philosophy or anybody like starting from like Plato, Aristotle sort of thing, right? It pretty much analyzes anybody and everybody who was of significance in the Western sort of thinking space. So you find that, and he also cites in some of his books, right? He also cites Edmund Burke and his conservatism and all of that. So he was somebody who was aware of like like all of that, right? Like some of these counter-revolutionary thinkers and all of that. You'll find some brief mentions of all of that as well in his book. But his own discourse, I think, the difference between somebody like Karpatri-ji and some like some of the other perennialist sort of thinkers is that I think somebody like Kumaraswamy, let's say, tries to look for a perennial sort of a model that applies across traditions and across religions. Karpatri-ji essentially says whatever that is Sanatana Dharma. So you need not try to invent something new. Whatever whatever is in the Vedic corpus, that indeed is the original found from which everything else came out, sort of thing. So if Karpatri-ji contested, let's say, a lot of these Aryan invasion, Aryan migration, and some of these models, right, where it said that all of this came from elsewhere, it was invented, and all of that. So he contested and all of that. He said that this, like Bharatavarsha or the Indian landmass, is where all of these things originated, and this is where this is like the heart or nerve center of everything else. and everyone else sort of moved out from here from like in centuries to centuries. So in his view, if you look at something like all of these Abrahamic religions that came out, like Islam, Christianity, and all of that, he would trace them as some sort of hearsays from the Sanatan Dharmic fount. So for him, these are like that's a different spin on the perennial philosophy sort of a mold, right? Which is I think that school tries to argue that there is a perennial philosophy as a foundation or as a fount, and then from that all of these religions sort of came out over time, and this perennial philosophy kind of connects everything. That's how they say. But I think Karpatri-ji sorts of says that like this is the original, or this is the one that is Sanatana, like the timeless sort of a beginningless, endless sort of philosophy is what is there in this Vedas and Shastras, all of this. And from this, from time to time, people may have moved out and people may have been banished or things like that, right? You might have violated some sort of a construct and you might have moved out. So that is, I think that's his way of looking at the whole Vedic sort of a model. So his thesis, you would not find him citing Western scholarship or Western political theory or even centuries, right? I mean, if you go back to first century or something like that, Karpatri-ji doesn't treat all of that as some sort of an original thinking for like his sort of a mold. For him, Vedas and Shastras are self-sufficient and complete in some sense. And whatever he proposes, he says this is a universal template that everyone can use. It is not something that uh, is like tied to a particular territory. So, in fact, just to go back to the earlier discussion, right, where some of the things where Karpatri-ji argues on Hindu nationalism is also this, where he says that Sanatana Dharma is a timeless and a perennial sort of thing, and this Veda Shastras, whatever they say, whatever is anchored, the theory of state or theory of society and polity that is anchored on that, that need not be territorially bound. So if you look at the whole journey of Sanatan Dharma and Sanskrit and all of this in general, right? They have traveled like all of Southeast Asia. You find traces of this in multiple places, right? So they are not bound by territory. So that's how Karpatri-ji kind of sees it. He doesn't. He really didn't look for an anchor in the Western political thought. He saw this as something self-sufficient and something universal, but he didn't secularize it and he didn't dilute it. He said, if you have to follow this sort of a thing, you will have to follow Shastras in like your territory. So if you look at how Hinduism or the Hindu kings conquered and spread in multiple places, right? They would have like gone to a particular territory and they would have perhaps conducted some yajnas there. You would have had some Brahmin priests going on, and they would have constructed this Varnashrama Dharma sort of an equivalent there. So that's how Hinduism sort of spread. So they didn't let go of this Shastric sort of an anchor. So that's how I think Karpatri-ji's proposition is a bit different. He didn't restrict it to that territory. He didn't say this is only for Hindus and this is only for this land between Himalayas and Indian Ocean. He didn't say that. He said that this Veda Shastra, whatever they say, is the original sort of Sanatana sort of tradition. This is what is the original, and this is from which everything else that you see in the world has originated from. So that's a bit of a different sort of a spin. That's how I see Karpatri-ji's discourse. Yep.
I see. Thank you. That's most enlightening. Um, so
Mm.
that actually kind of I'm sort of ordering my questions here because there's a number of things I want to touch on.
Yeah, I mean, it's also like a complex topic, right? There's just so much going on. So, I mean, we are just
Yeah.
having a conversation. I don't know if I'm doing enough justice to what all you wanted to cover, but it's just so complex that even to level set, it takes so much time.
No, you're doing a fantastic job. So thank you very much. Okay, let me pursue this thread, and that might segue into something else.
Sure.
You said so he rejects the Aryan invasion or the Aryan migration
Right.
things, right? So
Right.
does that mean he sees the Aryans as coming from within India proper, or there's also this older idea that doesn't really have any currency in the West anymore? I don't know how it's viewed in India, but that the Aryans came
Mm.
out of the Himalayas, but that might
Right.
be
Right.
more relevant in his time. I don't know. So which of those is?
Yeah, yeah. So I think, I mean, this whole theorization around Aryans, again, that's a very like a 19th, 20th century thing. If you look at anything prior to the like Indologist colonialism sort of an epoch, you would barely find any mention for any of these theories. So I think it is a theory that got constructed in a very particular time in history. So somebody like Karpatri-ji, let's say, if you're aware of some of the nationalist sort of discourse that happened in the 20th century, even people like Balagangadhar Tirak, for example, he he was like a famous freedom fighter, but he also had a thesis where he put in that like Aryans came from the Arctic and that sort of a thing. So Karpatri-ji contested all of that as well, like people coming from um, Europe, Central Asia, Eurasia, all of that, right? So he contested all of that. And in the traditional discourse, I think the definition of Arya is a bit different. It is not seen as a geographic indicator. It is not seen as belonging to a particular region or anything. They are defined more as Arya are essentially people of that sort of a refined conduct, or people who follow the Shastras, that sort of a model. So the traditional discourse doesn't have this differentiation between like Aryans and Dravidians and that sort of a thing. So in Karpatri-ji's discourse on a nation state, you would find a lot of all of that as well. He rejects this whole categorization that Aryans came from outside and Dravidian culture existed here, or this whole idea that, like I said, right? I mean, indigenous people or tribal people, they are called Adivasis. Adivasi again, like the first people sort of a thing, right? So he rejects all of that. He rejects these things, saying that Aryas came from outside, Adivasis were there, Dravidians were there. So I think these are things that he rejects. So there is no coming from sort of a thing. So if you look at the traditional discourse, it argues more on this anadi, apaurusheya, ananta sort of a construct. Anadi means beginningless. Apaurusheya means there is no creator, or there's no like a prophetic figure who is starting all of this, right? And then ananta is endless. So in this whole cyclical sort of a formulation, if you look at how tradition explains these things coming up, right? So there is always this notion of, I mean, that whole cyclical cosmos sort of creation, ending pralaya and all of that, right? So we have a theory of yugas, where yugas keep recurring. And then we have a srishti and purasrishti sort of a thing, which means these cycles of creation keep happening. So in the traditional discourse, these Vedas are also seen as something that persists across these cycles of creation. So you have this model that when the new cycle of creation is happening, then the god Brahma, he'll like recollect and recite those Vedas once again, and then they sort of like that whole formulation sort of takes over once again. So in that sort of a cosmic time scale and like beginningless, endless sort of a formulation, right? This question will find very, I mean, it will be like an absurd question. If you ask me, if Aryans came in 3000 BC, did they come from Arctic or from like Europe or from Himalayas and all of that? It's like an absurd question, because the traditional discourse that Karpatri-ji is anchored on, he doesn't refer to any period as a Vedic period. So if you look at the historicist model, right, they say that, I mean, if you open Wikipedia and then look for Rig Veda, right, they'll say 1500 BCE. Someone else will say, no, it is maybe 3000 BCE sort of a model. But the traditionalist mind, it rejects this notion that there was a Vedic period, a pre-Vedic period, post-Vedic period sort of thing. Veda is seen as something that is anadi and ananta, which means it is something that is endless, it is beginningless, and it is kind of something that it's like it's the original Sanatana perennial sort of eternal sort of a thing, right? So they'll say that there was never a time when Vedas weren't there. Vedas like are always there. And if you look at the traditional discourse on our gods and on our peoples and all of that, it is very difficult to put your finger and then say that this is when it started, because they'll just go to, I mean, if you look at the traditional discourse, they'll just say that it was so and so yuga and so happened, or so and so god came here and in that particular avatar so and so happened, and then uh, that's when this particular place of pilgrimage came up and all of that, right? So we have, let's say, this discourse of Shakti Pitas, which means the goddess Parvati and is seen as a replication of all these Pitas, right? So all of her own cosmic or her own body parts fell into multiple places in the sacred geography, and each of that became like a kshetra or a temple or a pilgrimage sort of a place. Now, if you ask somebody, tell me which date or which point in time did this happen, it's a very absurd question. So if there are like, let's say, 52 Shakti Pitas, I'm not going to say that this Shakti Pita started in this BC. This was just after Aryans came. That is when this temple came up. It's just an absurd thing in that for sort of a sense of time sort of a formulation. Same thing for, let's say, a place like Kashi, right? Kashi has the sacred Kashi Vishwanatha sort of a temple. So for a believer who believes in the notion of the temple, it's an absurd question to ask when did this particular form of Shiva came in here. It's a nobody can even put a date on that. It's just an absurd question. So that's where I think a lot of these contestation on this whole Aryan migration and all of this comes into the picture. Because once the moment you say this, right, that Aryan invasion or migration, or these days they are also calling Aryan traders. So whatever you call that, if you once you put a date saying that let's say 2000 BCE is when this happened, then immediately this question comes up, right? Then what before 2000 BCE? So in the traditional discourse, there is no that sort of a pre-Vedic sort of a time didn't exist. So that's where I mean a lot of this politicization happens, right? Where somebody says this particular Adivasi or this particular indigenous tribe is a pre-Aryan tribe. Somebody will say that then my culture is different. You try to impose your Hindu culture onto me. So we keep running into all of these sort of things from time to time. And the traditional discourse kind of flips everything, right? It doesn't even put a date. So it says that there is no pre-Vedic period, there is no post-Vedic period, there is no Aryan migration, there is no that sort of a thing, right? I think that was good for the traditional mind to process, but for the modern mind, with a historicist sort of mind with all of its baggage, right? We cannot accept this notion that of timeless or dateless sort of a thing. We want a date. So we want to explicitly put a date and then put it on stone and say that this is when Veda started. This is when Vedic civilization started. So somebody like Karpatri-ji contest all of that. I mean, if you look at the whole colonial epoch discourse in the 20th century, we have this whole notion of Indus Valley civilization, Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, and all of that. So Karpatri-ji contests all of that also. He rejects this notion that Harappan civilization was different from Vedic civilization, and Vedic civilization came after Harappan civilization and all of that. He says that even in the Harappan civilization, I mean, this is like a constant ongoing debate, right? You see this Pashupati, that sort of a notion, right? You see that sort of a worship. So in the traditional discourse, people see all of these as traces of some Sanatana sort of a traditional continuity, and they see all these as expressions of the same continuity. So we reject this formulation of this being non-Vedic or something different and all of that. So I think that's the challenge where that's where I think the modernist mind will have a problem with somebody like Karpatri-ji's discourse, because he rejects all of these timelines. He says that you cannot say Arya is a outsider, right? He'll just say Aryan is somebody who is following the Shastras, and Arya is a person of refinement. Anarya is a person who doesn't have this refinement. So you have this construct. Let's say we have a traditional notion of a mlecha. Mlecha means an outsider who cannot, who lacks this refinement in speech, who cannot pronounce Sanskrit, that sort of a thing. So those are the configurations that we have, but we didn't have this configuration of outsider, insider. I came then and you came later, or you were here and I came after you. That sort of a construct doesn't exist in tradition.
So maybe I'm being very stupid here, but tell me if I've misunderstood. Is that correct then to understand that Karpatri-ji doesn't understand Aryan to be an ethnic term, that he understands it just in the sense of someone who's noble, or
Correct,
right?
correct,
Okay, so he
correct, correct.
completely rejects it. It's an ethnic.
Yeah, he rejects it. Yeah, yeah. Because I think once the moment you put it as an ethnic or a territorial sort of a term, then this whole thing of outsider, insider, and all of this comes into the
Mhm,
picture.
mhm.
So he rejects that. Yeah. Yeah.
So that segues into something I wanted to ask you. I think I sort of tacked it on as a question in our
Mhm,
exchanges, because I have some subscribers who I know are Westerners who are very interested in Hinduism,
mhm,
maybe as a
mhm.
personal path. And
Right,
my understanding, which I get from Kumar Swami and people like that, is that Hinduism is something that you have to be born into, that it's not
right.
or at least that's what I've read in Kumar Swami. And from what you're saying about Swami Karpatri-ji, he still had very much insisted that caste is not quite, it's by birth, not by qualification. Um,
Correct, correct.
but I've also read, I think in a paper by Renaud Fabry, I don't know if you're familiar,
Mhm.
that Swami Karpatri-ji did initiate
He
Westerners.
did. Yes,
So,
yes.
so could you, how do those two things square?
Yeah, sure, sure. So I think, like again, the answer for this is a bit complex, right? So if you look at what I mentioned early on, which is also that Hinduism was not, or Hindu Dharma, Sanatan Dharma, whatever you call it was not territorially bound. It did spread across continents. It did spread across various places. So if you say this thing, if you take this thing too seriously, that this is something you need to born into and you don't have any other choice, but like our own lived reality of centuries is not that. You had several Hindu civilizations and Hindu cultural continuities and kingdoms, even outside of this territorial bound. So you'll see it in Indonesia, you'll see it in Cambodia and places like that, right? So people did travel. People did travel, and there was this constant interaction with new cultures. I think the difference maybe is that like the real challenge, and that is something that Karpatri-ji also talks about in some of his own works, that so long as you are accommodative of this idea of jatis, which is these different multiplicities of cultures, right? There is no problem for somebody to become a Hindu, because in that sense, that particular jati will change its own achara and vyavahara, which is their own conduct and traditions, to uh, uh, blend into this whole Hindu sort of a universe, and that kept happening all the time. So people, as groups, as collectives, people did move. Individually, also, some people did get initiated into some particular sampradayas. But I think the challenge comes in only, and that is something again Karpatri-ji talks about very explicitly, right? If you say that I want to become a part of that particular Brahmin lineage, or I want to be considered as, let's say, you are picking the next Shankaracharya, right? You are picking from a bunch of traditionally trained Brahmin lineages. That's where you are picking from. And then as an outsider, you come in and say that I'm ready to get trained in all of that. I want to be considered as an eligible candidate for the next Shankaracharya, right? So that sort of a thing is where this model hits into a conflict, because that's where Karpatri-ji is very clear that you cannot get into like these sort of lineages. So you can continue to embrace and you can continue to get into a lot of these sampradayas and initiations, but you have to follow the rule book as per that particular sampradaya. You cannot claim to become something else. So even though there was a lot of this sort of a model that was happening, but they had their own rules and they had their own procedures. So they were considered a particular kind of jati, or a particular kind of initiated sannyasis, or a particular kind of sampradaya and things like that. So it was not like everybody was considered eligible to become everything, or everybody was considered as an eligible candidate for every particular jati. And there was also the another part of conversions or reconversions that Karpatri-ji, let's say, had also overseen, and some of his own disciples also talk about that even today, right? Which is that uh, you were of a particular jati or of a particular sampradaya, and then let's say an Islamic invasion happened, or some sort of a conversion attempt happened, or some sort of a missionary sort of a thing happened. You lost your that connect to the religion, and then after a generation or two, you want to come back, right? But you still carry memories of your past and all of that. So in those cases, people used to go back to that particular the previous jati that they were into, or previous sampradaya that they were into before all of this conversion happened. So you see that also playing out overall in the Hindu spaces, particularly in the last, let's say, 10, 12 centuries post the Islamic epoch. You would see a lot of that happening. In fact, some of the biggest or the largest Hindu empires in South India, which is the Vijayanagara kingdom, that Vijayanagara kingdom itself had a strong connection with Swami Vidyaranya, who again is a part of this broader Shankaracharya sort of a universe. And Vidyaranya himself had initiated or had reconverted two princes, or two people who went on to become a part of the royal lineage of that particular empire. And these were people who had to go through some of this sort of a ghar wapasi, as they today call in the political parlance. They had to come back into Hinduism because they fell out of the fold because of some of these external currents. So you see that also happening, and Karpatri-ji writes about that as well. That you need to perhaps do some kind of a prayashchita, or some kind of a ritual sort of a thing to come back to your own sort of jati. And he was also initiating other people, like you said. So there was that also happening. But again, there is a balance. So it had its own rule book. It had its own layer. So he uses this Hindi term. He says this thing called Shreni Bhed. Shreni Bhed essentially means, you can think of it like a lane discipline sort of a thing, right? So although you are converted, although you have been initiated, you need to follow the rules and disciplines of that particular lane. You cannot lay claim onto some other lane and then say that because I'm now a Hindu, I'm equally eligible to get into any of these lineages. So I think that is where somebody like Karpatri-ji was, although he was accommodative of some of these, he was also very cognizant of these lineage continuities, these Varna continuities, Jati continuities, and all of that. And again, like that's again one of these things that continues to be heavily contested with the whole Hindutva sort of a space, right? Because they say that Um, you cannot continue to cling on to these like varna, jati, by birth sort of categories. So many people are falling out of the fold. So many people are becoming Christians and Muslims, let's say. And then, like you said, there are so many from the West who are saying that I want to become Hindu, I want to come into your fold. So there is that also happening. So I think so. Again, it's like an ongoing sort of a challenge. We have found out some sort of interim solutions where people are indeed getting initiated into some particular sampradayas and some particular ways of life. But if the idea is that everybody should be able to lay a claim on every single identity, I think that is a model that Karpatri-ji didn't endorse. And that is a model that even today's Hindu society doesn't endorse that much. So I think that's where we still have this bit of a challenge. Like I said, if you look at how the Shankaracharyas are initiated or selected, right? They have their own model and they have their own rules. So it is not like anybody and everybody can become a Shankaracharya. And similarly, a lot of these jatis have their own sampradayas and their own initiation. So some, let's say some of the modern ones, if you look at some things like, let's say the ISKCON or the Ramakrishna Mission, or you have like Art of Living and then Sadhguru's Isha and all of these, right? I mean, you have Brahma Kumaris, you have Swami Narayan, so many of these sampradayas that are there today, right? So each have their own initiation model. So some of them may appear they are more open to this like equal opportunity for all sort of a model. Some others may have many more rules. So I think the Hindu model, uh, I mean, you have all these diversities. So you can perhaps accommodate multiple people in multiple ways. But if somebody says, I want to be that, then
Mm.
it's a bit of a problem. So I think that's where I think Karpatri-ji's discourse differs a bit, where he allows for this initiation sort of models, but that also is with a lot of checks and balances.
So did Karpatri-ji ever comment on ISKCON? I'm just curious if about that.
Uh, I mean, ISKCON per se, I have not come across, although some of Karpatri-ji's own disciples in the current day, they do comment a lot. I mean, this is like a whole constant back and forth that keeps going on in the Hindu space, where when you have so many diverse sampradayas, right? Everybody will have their own perspective on things. So some are very critical of some of these activities that happen. But personally, like from what I have read, I can't recollect Karpatri-ji specifically talking about ISKCON because I think ISKCON perhaps became big post 80s, perhaps.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
and Karpatri-ji's time of activity was largely from prior to that, right? So it is like, I think till up until 70s or late 70s is when I think he was doing a lot of commentary on some of these. I can't recollect I mean, like a work specifically talking about ISKCON, but he does write a lot about lot of these reform movements that have come about in the 20th century. So specifically, Arya Samaj, for example, Arya Samaj was a 20th, like late 19th century, 20th century movement. So there is a lot of back and forth that goes on between the Arya Samaj sort of perspective and Karpatri-ji's sort of model. And there's also a mention, I mean, he does talk about bits and pieces about Ramakrishna, about Vivekananda and their model. So a lot of this does happen, but ISKCON specifically, I can't recollect.
Okay. So just sorry, I was curious about that.
Sure. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just generally curious about kind of because and I speak here from ignorance because I know a little but I don't know enough to really have an opinion.
Right. Right.
So I'm always curious about what how traditional or orthodox is ISKCON seen as being, because I mean where I live they have a great presence, so I'm always think they're always sort of in
Correct.
front of me,
Correct.
you know.
Yeah.
So it's
Right.
something I'm interested for about a Hindu perspective on that. I mean, but to circle back to politics, um
Mhm.
what you were saying about his his principial perspective on how politics should be arranged with this plurality of this legal pluralism, let's call it. Um,
Mhm.
and then it seems to me that this plurality of rajas that you had traditionally in India, that's sort of a
Mhm.
natural extension of that, right?
Right.
Um, eh, whereas the parliamentary democratic system that you have from
Mhm.
independence onwards, there's something sort of inherently uniformizing and centralizing
Correct.
about that.
Correct.
So
Yeah.
in Swami Karpatri's thought, is there any space for parliamentary democracy, or is that something he rejects completely, or does he not really talk about it? Or I'm just I'd be interested to know.
Yeah. I mean, he talks about it a lot in the whole Ramarajya Parishad sort of a construct and everything else around it, right? He does talk about it, but I think he's very cognizant of these homogenizing and centralizing and secularizing tendencies of modern nation state and parliamentary democracy and these constructs, right? So I think the place where he argues from is that you cannot have this model of like one country, one law sort of a thing. So even though you can have leaders getting elected from a particular region, but ultimately they all owe their allegiance to like a dharmic sort of a universe. And in that dharmic sort of a compass, there is no homogenization or there is no like one single prescription for everybody kind of a model. So I think that's where I think if you look at this whole Hindu code bill discourse, that is all essentially around that. Because at that time, what the state was trying to do was to create one law for all Hindus kind of a model. Although in practice, again, they ended up making a lot of exceptions. So even if you look at how Hindu law operated over time, they ended up making exceptions saying if you belong to so and so tribal, then maybe you go and get an exception, or if you belong to some uh, particular flavor, right? So then they make exceptions for that as well. And their own definition of Hindu also they ended up definitioning like defining Hindu in terms of negatives, which is that if you're not this and if you're not that, then you are a Hindu kind of thing, which is why you have like Jains, Buddhists, Sikhs, everybody trying to abide by that law. And we keep running, I mean, every other day you keep running to these court cases where people will like take to the court and then say that like Hindu law should not apply to me because I am from this particular tribe and for me that this is different and all of that, right? So Karpatri-ji was acutely aware of all of that, where he contested these things, saying that you cannot design this one particular state sort of a model and then you decide for everything for everyone, which is to say, like if you go back to that earlier example that I gave on Sagotra marriages, right, which is marrying within your Gotra. If your tradition says you should not do that, and everybody is following that at the ground level, you cannot create a state a law at the top by saying that this is all right to do. So
Mm.
he was acutely aware of this power of homogenizing and centralizing sort of a thing that the state can do. And he was continuously contesting all of these throughout his lifetime. So, I mean, he understood the change that is happening with the parliamentary democracy and nation state, but he was continuously pointing out these flaws that the moment you become a secularized sort of a state, you will try to invent these things which are like anti-traditional and anti-continuity sort of a construct. And he was like contesting all of that. And there's also like demographics, right? You also will end up doing one law for all Hindus, Christians, and Muslims, all of that.
Mm.
So how is that going to work as well? So he writes about all of those things as well. That you need to have some sort of an anchor based on which you can decide what is right. What is wrong, and that anchor has to be your shastras. So I think he was acutely aware, but then there's no straight answer because uh, if suddenly today all of the parliamentarians decide to become more closer to the Karpatri-ji sort of a universe, right? Then I think all hell will break loose. It's not going to be that simple because I mean, for at least 100, 150 years, we have been in this modernizing, reforming sort of a journey. So some of these things are also repulsive to a lot of Hindus today. So even you need not even go as far as like your Western friends asking, how do I come to Hinduism sort of thing, right? Even within the Hindu spaces, even today, everything is not open for everybody. I
Mm.
mean, there's still a lot of these rules and regulations and the birth lineages, sampradaya lineages, and all of these things. So Hinduism still continues to operate in this sort of a mix and match sort of a model, where in some cases we are like exceptionally strict with a lot of these Shastra hereditary sort of rules. And in some cases, we have a lot of these new sort of models and new sort of things that have emerged where things are much more open and much more equal and much more, let's say, like egalitarianism compliant sort of thing. But in some others are not. So I think it's still quite complex. But we do have, I mean, I think Karpatriji's works at least provide an anchor that way to understand what exactly was happening in these 100, 150 years, right? Like um, when a state comes up or when a parliamentary democracy comes up, what does it change in a traditional sort of a civilization? So I think to understand those perspectives, Karpatriji's discourse is indeed very useful.
So let me put this question very crudely in this sort of hypothetical where
Mhm, mhm.
every MP becomes a Carpatrian. Um,
Right, right.
is there still going to be a parliament? Is there still going to be a national army? I mean, do you see what I'm saying, or is that how reconcilable are those kinds of things with a Karpatri's perspective?
Yeah, yeah, sure. I think it's a good thought experiment, I'd say. At least the army part, I think, given how things are, right, territorially, I think army is not something that is going to get decentralized anyway. But what Karpatri-ji's model would essentially allow for is this sort of a Shastra anchored sort of pluralism. I think that is what it would allow for. Even if you have, let's say, like multiple MPs and all of that, right? Each
Mm,
representing their own region, they'd all perhaps try to cling on to like their own manifestation of Hinduism in their own region,
mm,
that sort of a thing, right? So even if you take simple things, even today, for example, despite all of this reform and modernization, all of that happened, people still follow like different calendars. So a particular festival may be celebrated in my region on a particular date, but let's say 3 hours away from my place, somebody else might be following a different calendar. Let's say somebody is following like a lunar calendar, somebody is following a solar calendar, those sort of things, right? And you also have these variations where, I mean, we have this today, even in the existing parliamentary democracy setup as well. You have this variation where a state festival of a particular state may be like absolutely alien to another state. So people still do that with even within this existing constraint. So you might see some more of that where people cling on to like their own sort of traditions, but you may also see this other flavor, right, where if you look at the Hindu history overall, there is this sacred geography sort of a model where even though you have all these multiplicities and diversities, there may be things like a Tirtha Yatra which connect one place which is like 1,000 kilometers away from another place, right? So a king belonging to a kingdom somewhere else might have actually consecrated a temple uh, uh, like miles away from his place. So you may have those sort of things that will sort of reawaken again, right? Where even today, for example, you may have a particular shrine which is, let's say, 10 hours away from my place, but the particular priest, that lineage that is there in that shrine might be continuing. It might have some connections with somebody in my region. So these sort of connections, I think they will continue to show up, even though uh, uh, people are like the army is still uh, different, right? I mean, it's not like a princely state sort of a construct, but I think people, this sort of a dharmic connections between multiple regions and multiple diversities, that will, I think, continue to persist. And the benefit, I think, if I'd say, is also that there'll be some more clarity. Like today, the secular law and the secular polity, the way it operates, its relationship with Hinduism is not very clear. Like I said, right, Hindu temples are under state control, but Christians and like churches and mosques get an exemption.
mm,
Education institutions also it's the same thing. Like you cannot run a full-blown Hindu dharmic educational institution today, but you can run a Christian institution by saying you have exceptions constitutionally to say this is a minority institute; it can run on its own. We have a lot of these conundrums where, like I said, the law today, Hindu law is within the secular ambit, but Muslim law is not like that.
mm.
Although things keep changing, we don't have a uniform law and all of that. So I think some of these will change if more and more people are anchored on this sort of a dharmic sort of a compass and not on a secular sort of a compass, some of these newer formulations will perhaps like open up on matters of education, on matters of like public culture and things like that. I think things may change a bit. Army, of course, I don't see any of that changing. Even in this hypothetical thought experiment sort of a scenario, I don't see princely states coming back. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I mean, we're sort of coming towards the end of the time we allotted for this, and I'll have to run in a minute. But I'd like to ask one more question, which is
Sure.
because you said earlier that you can sort of put Nehru and Gandhi in a on a spectrum, and I think that's
Right.
true, at least from a certain perspective. But there's another perspective or another sense in which Gandhi was this, and I say this with a little admiration, an extreme reactionary. Like he wanted to jump back to the Gurta Yuga, the golden age,
Right. Yeah.
um, which from what I hear from you, I don't see that in Karpatri-ji. So,
Right.
was there? Does Swami Karpatri talk about Gandhi much? Is there much critique of Gandhi in his writings, or is that yeah? Could you speak?
Yes, yes. I mean, you'd also see, in fact, Karpatri-ji writing letters to Gandhi, and Gandhi, I mean, you see letters to Gandhi, that sort of an exchange as well. He does refer to Gandhi in a lot of like his work in multiple places. But I think like Gandhi also is a bit of a complex sort of a character, right? Like there are many Gandhis inside Gandhi, if you ask me. So
Mm-mm.
the way he was at the, let's say, at the start of 20th century, and then how he progressed from there to later, is all like very different. Like personally, if you ask somebody like me, there is this work of Gandhi from the early 20th century called Hind Swaraj. I am a big admirer of that work. So, although I'm an admirer of Karpatri-ji as well, I'm also an admirer of Gandhi for that. So, I see a lot of commonalities there because Hind Swaraj Gandhi was also like deeply critical of a lot of modernity and all of that. So, he was that. But then in the later parts, right, I think Gandhi also, like I said at the start, he tried to anchor too much on this mythical Hindu Muslim unity sort of a thing, and he didn't get too deep into this whole Shastra Sampradaya sort of a universe. So if you look at Gandhi's own version of religion, right, it is he tried to spiritualize and syncretize a lot of it too much. So some of his famous Gandhi's bhajans and hymns also that we use, they're also some sort of a doctored sort of versions where he tried to blend in Hindu Muslim syncretism into that. The original versions of those bhajans didn't have it. I think he was trying to construct this sort of a syncretic Hindu Muslim brotherhood sort of religion without addressing some of these inner conflicts between an Abrahamic religion and a Sanatana Dharma sort of a thing, between a Semitic sort of a construct versus a Dharmic sort of a construct. He didn't go into all that. And then over time, he also got too much into this reformist sort of a zone as well. So if you read Gandhiji's own writings from the early part of 20th century to, let's say, the subsequent decades, a lot of that also changes. So on those, Karpatri-ji again contested a lot with them, like with the reform, like all kinds of reformers, right? Like because Karpatri-ji tried to stand for this whole hereditary Varnashrama sort of a model, and over time, Gandhiji, although initially he was trying to see merits in that sort of a model, if you look at the later parts of Gandhiji's discourse, especially the last few years, he went pretty much into the Ambedkarite, Savarkarite sort of a territory where he said caste has to go, intercaste marriages have to happen, women should actively seek people outside their caste, and all of that. He spoke of all of that. So I think those things Karpatri-ji again contested a lot, and I think that continues to keep happening all the time, even to this day. So there's that whole traditionalist orthodoxy sort of a thing, and this one that keeps happening. And even like I spoke of temple entry at the start, right? That is again like a huge dividing sort of a point between the Hindu traditionalist sort of a discourse and the Hindu reformist or Hindu modernist sort of a discourse. Gandhiji was one of the pioneering figures who fought on temple entry, and Karpatri-ji was somebody who contested a lot of things around temple entry. Again, mostly because of these reasons, right? Like we didn't even have this conception of a public Hindu temple that was open for all prior to that era. So I think there was a lot of that also happening. So you do see a lot of these Gandhi Karpatri sort of debates, and perhaps I mean those are all perhaps topics for some other discussion. Like some of Karpatriji's discourse, like I mean, although like we discussed at the start, right? You don't find enough of it in English, but if you were to really do justice to that, you'll perhaps have, I don't know, like 100 hours or 200 hours of content. There's
Mm.
just so much that Karpatriji has written about, and these confrontations between Karpatri-ji and Hindu modern Hindutva, Karpatri-ji and Nehru, Karpatri-ji Ambedkar, Karpatri-ji Gandhi. There are like so many layers to all of this, and yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to answer these in a like a 5-10 minute sort of a space.
No, no, of course, but you've done an admirable job in sort of trying to synthesize what Karpatri-ji has to say about politics. So thank you very much. Um,
Sure.
so, but just before we conclude, is there, it's customary to ask, where can people reach you, or do you have any projects you'd like to promote or things of that nature?
Yeah, like I'm active on Twitter or X. So my handle is Halley-Ji, Halleyji. That's the place where I'm usually active. So you can find me there. But yeah, I mean, otherwise I'm broadly, I'm just sharing what I read, and I'm sharing my thinking on some of these. And a lot of my talks are also available on YouTube on some of these topics. You can search for Halley Kalyan and you'll find a lot of these talks. So that's a space that I'm anchored in. And I continue to take a lot of support and knowledge from some of the thinkers from perennial philosophy school as well, right? So that's how like I could relate to some of the content on your channel as well. So yeah, yeah, and it's been like a very freewheeling conversation. I know I might have rambled a bit as well, but the nature of this topic is like that it is so. So I hope I did justice to what you wanted to extract from this particular topic.
No, I'm very happy with it. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a good evening.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, you
Thank
too. Have a nice day. Bye.
you. Bye bye. If you value my work, I'd be most grateful if you would like, subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with anyone you think might be interested. If you would like to support me in working on this project, I'd be deeply thankful if you would consider becoming a regular supporter through Patreon or making a one-time donation through Ko-fi, links in the description. If you do subscribe, please remember to hit that little bell icon, because otherwise YouTube won't inform you when I upload new videos. If you'd prefer to read my essays over the video format, they are all available in written form on Substack, link also in the description.